Está sendo transmitido pelo YouTube como uma excelente ideia do professor David Wilson, para a gente poder abrir oportunidade para todos e todas no mundo verem mais um pouquinho do trabalho. Eu vou dar um bom dia para as pessoas então, que estão no YouTube. Good morning from Brazil. It is a privilege to be
Bom
with
dia desde o Brasil, é um privilégio estar com David Wilson.
are broadcasting this conference on YouTube to spread it to all community and mark the strength that prosocial has in the world. Welcome, everyone. E bem-vindos aqui, toda a família CEFI, como a gente costuma falar. E dentro da coerência da abordagem, no finalzinho, não vai ser uma conferência tradicional onde uma pessoa fala e os outros escutam. Vai ser uma conferência no final com trocas. Então, o professor pediu, por favor, vão anotando as dúvidas, as ideias durante a fala dele, que no final a gente vai conversar. Ok? David, estamos por você.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone. I'm so delighted to be with you and to be with anyone in the world on YouTube. I just spent a week at the Plum Village Monastery, founded by Thich Nhat Hanh in France, and just left there this morning. I'm in a hotel meeting room in order to give this talk, and then I'll be catching an airplane on my way back home to the United States. And that's so appropriate because Plum Village is truly a social organism. That's how they think of themselves. And that, of course, is also the topic of our of my talk. So I will share my screen. And here we have three images of groups as organisms, one from politics. This is the very famous cover of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. One from religion, the body of the church united under the head of Christ, and from the environment, Gaia. And so this is a very familiar metaphor, and it has venerable roots. Here is a quote from a psychologist named Daniel Wegner, who writes, social commentators once found it very useful to analyze the behavior of groups by the same expedient used in analyzing the behavior of individuals. The group, like the person, was assumed to be sentient, to have a form of mental activity that guides action. Rousseau and Hegel were the early architects of this form of analysis, and it became so widely used in the 19th and early 20th century that almost every early social theorist we now recognize as a contributor to modern social psychology held a similar view. And so the concept of groups as organisms is very old indeed, but if it sounds strange, it's because of another tradition that's been the dominant tradition for our lifetimes. And here's another quote by the psychologist Donald Campbell, who wrote, "A methodological individualism dominates our neighboring field of economics, much of sociology, and all of psychology's excursions into organizational theory. This is the dogma that all human social group processes are to be explained by laws of individual behavior, that groups and social organizations have no ontological reality, that where used, references to organizations, etc., are but convenient summaries of individual behavior." And so I love the proverb, the hardest thing for a fish to see is water. This individualism is indeed been the dominant tradition in our lifetimes. It manifests as homo economicus in economics, as methodological individualism in the social sciences, And in my field of evolutionary biology, it manifested as the concept of selfish genes and the theory of individual selection, as if everything that evolves must be explained in terms of individual advantage. And closer to home, it manifests in the psychology field as the individual as the primary unit of therapy and training. I believe that's probably true for the people who are listening to this, who are practicing psychologists. And it pervades everyday life, represented by the notorious quip by Margaret Thatcher. This was in the 1980s, that there is no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families. And so what I want to talk about today is a paradigm, a new paradigm that can replace individualism. And I have quite a lot to cover. So this is quite a full menu here. I'm going to begin by making some general points about functional analysis. And then I'm going to introduce multi-level selection theory. This is my main contribution as an evolutionary biologist. And that will lead to a view of our own species as highly group selected. And then I will finally get to the main event as far as this group is concerned, implications for therapy and training. I will cover opportunities for developing this framework in Brazil and Latin America. And all of this is based on an article that I co-authored with the clinical neuroscientist Jim Cohen at the University of Virginia. And this article appeared in a special issue of the journal Clinical Psychology Review, titled Clinical Psychology as Applied Evolutionary Science, which I co-edited with Stephen Hoffman and Stephen C. Hayes, who has been a previous plenary speaker at this Congress. And I know that quite a few of the people on this call are members of ACBS, and so they're familiar with some of these people. And all of this can be nested within something still larger, which is that Darwin's theory of evolution is beginning to provide the same kind of theoretical foundation for all aspects of humanity as it has for the biological sciences. Long ago, biologists have loved to boast about nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Evolution provides a passport for understanding all aspects of life, but only now has that been extended to all things human. I call this completing the Darwinian revolution. And it means that I can give a talk such as this to a clinical psychology audience. I could give a very similar talk and have to economics and business, politics and international relations, religion and spirituality. That's what brought me to Plum Village, and to the idea of regenerative culture, which is one of the newest ways of framing this. And so this is so very broad. And one of the things I want to emphasize. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about functional analysis. Here is a snowflake. And I would like you to think about how you would study this object. A snowflake has lots of physical structure, so much that everyone is indeed unique, but it is not functionally organized to do anything. And so therefore, the only way to analyze it is in physical terms of the process of ice crystallization. So that's how we study non-functional objects. So here is a functional object. It's a pocket watch. It also has lots of physical structure, but it is designed to do something, namely to keep time. And the fact that it is functionally organized determines how we go about studying the object. Everything that makes up the object, all of its parts, we know that we need to analyze in terms of its contribution to the whole. We know this even without being taught. Well, here is a cog within a watch, or maybe it's a cog within something else. And so how would we study this object? We can be sure that this cog is part of something larger than itself, and that larger thing is functionally organized. But we really can't say much about the function of this cog without knowing more about the whole of which it is a part. Isn't that true? And so already we have made progress. So here is an interim summary that functional analysis requires identifying the functional unit and making it a kind of anchor of analysis. Everything below the level of the functional unit is analyzed in terms of its contribution to the function. And now the functional unit can also be analyzed as part of some larger system. We can think about watches in terms of the economy of Switzerland or the history of watchmaking, but that does not imply that the larger system is also functionally organized. Well, let's continue. Here's another object. It is a living object, a fruit fly. How would we study it? And like a watch, an organism such as a fruit fly is functionally organized, this time by natural selection, to survive and reproduce in its environment. And so we would study its parts, just like the parts of a watch, in the same way. All of its organs, cells, and molecules, how they contribute to the survival and reproduction of the fly. But we would not study populations of fruit flies or ecosystems that include fruit flies as functionally organized units. And this is so very important to make this point. So I have some examples of populations and communities that are not functionally organized. The flies are functionally organized, but not populations and ecosystems. And so what sometimes happens is that natural selection increases the reproductive rate of fruit flies, but that can actually destabilize their population dynamics, cause them to become chaotic. And so the population has become, selection at the level of the individual has disrupted the dynamics of the population. In many, many social species, infanticide, that's killing the babies of others to have your own babies, is one of the greatest source of mortality. So adults that commit infanticide survive and reproduce better than adults that don't. And so infanticide evolves. But that's not good for the population or anything but the infanticidal individuals. In many migratory bird species, females suffer higher mortality because males claim the best habitats during migration and on the wintering ground. Well, that's good for the males. The males are functionally organized, but it's not good for the females. It's not good for the species. And then finally, beaver ecosystems can be, so beavers are ecosystem engineers. They transform the entire habitat around them. But the best way to understand it is primarily what's in it for the beavers. And then everything else about the ecosystem, we can think of as collateral effects of beavers maximizing their own fitness. So although species are adapted, populations and ecosystems are not necessarily adaptive. Now, and so to bring it back home a little bit more in a human case, how should we watch a drama such as Game of Thrones, which we all love to watch? In a drama such as this, individuals and alliances are functionally organized, and their behaviors are coordinated to achieve common goals. So we can think of individuals and alliances a bit like parts of a watch. But their interactions with each other are primarily conflictual. You wouldn't think about what takes place for the entire population as at all like a watch. And so this can be stated in the language of complex systems theory and its key term, complex adaptive system. It means that we need to distinguish between two meanings of complex adaptive systems. One is a complex system that is adaptive as a system, such as a watch and a single organism. And the second is a complex system composed of agents following their respective adaptive strategies, like the Game of Thrones. Two meanings of complex adaptive systems. And the most important message to take away is that CAS2 systems do not robustly organize into CAS1 systems. It is not the case that systems whose agents are following their respective adaptive strategies somehow self-organize into systems that work well as systems. Another way of saying this is that the metaphor of the invisible hand is profoundly untrue. Special conditions are required for CAS systems to evolve. And of course, that's what we need to do. Every aspect of positive social change basically requires converting CAS2 systems into CAS1 systems. And so I'm going to illustrate this in about 3 different ways just to hammer it home. It is deeply intuitive once you get the hang of it. And we can see this with the game of Monopoly. I believe almost everyone's played it, so we know how it goes. And the game of Monopoly is a process of competition among individuals within a single group. Individuals are competing for the real estate, and the goal is for one individual to drive everyone else bankrupt. There is almost no context for cooperation in the game of Monopoly. The only context for cooperation is when the losers, those that are losing the game, might cooperate in order to beat the one who is currently winning, only so that they can compete with each other. Because at the end of the day, there's only one winner in the game of Monopoly. But suppose we change it a little bit and we have a Monopoly tournament. And so now many games are in play, and the trophy goes to the team that collectively develops their real estate the fastest. So imagine playing that game, and I think you can see that now that the process of competition is among groups, among teams, then this would trigger teamwork in the players. There's no reason to beat your fellow player, and so teamwork would be elicited. And isn't it interesting that us human beings are able to play both types of games? So we play and enjoy the single game of Monopoly, and we also play and enjoy working in teams. So, and yet, now the primary context for cooperation is within each group. There is no context for cooperation among the teams, And so, we're beginning to see how the level of cooperation depends on the level of competition. And so to summarize, the single game of Monopoly involves competition among individuals within a single group. The Monopoly tournament involves competition among groups in a multi-group population. And to get cooperation among teams of a Monopoly tournament, we would need to add another layer of competition among teams. So we would have something like teams of teams. And so evolution is like this. This is why it's called multi-level selection. Precisely as with my Monopoly example, natural selection within groups is like the single game of Monopoly, and it results in disruptive self-seeking behaviors. We can call these low prosociality behaviors or low pro. And Natural selection between groups is like the Monopoly tournament, and that results in cooperative individuals, at least within groups. We'll call them HiPro. So the bottom line, the take-home message, is that teamwork does not come for free. It requires a process of selection at the team level and is opposed by selection among individuals within teams. Evolution is weighing in opposite directions. At one scale, evolution is weighing in terms of selfish low-pro behaviors, and at another scale, evolution is weighing in favor of cooperative high-pro behaviors. And what results depends on the relative strength of those two processes. Very easy to understand after you get the hang of it. Well, let me give you a real-world example, one that I have been using for many decades, and it involves artificial selection in the poultry industry. How do we breed a more productive strain of hen? And hens lived in groups. Hens, little background noise here. Okay. And hens live in groups. They always have lived in flocks. Nowadays, I'm sad to say, they often live in cages. And in these experiments, all of them lived in cages. And in the first experiment, the most productive hen within each group was selected to breed the next generation of hens. And the result of that was not what you'd expect. It was a hyper-aggressive strain of hen, because the most productive egg layer within each group was the biggest bully, who suppressed the egg laying of the other hens. That experiment was like the single game of Monopoly. What you see in the top left picture there is the result of this experiment after 5 generations. You see only 3 hens because the others have been murdered. And they plucked each other in their incessant attacks on themselves. And so this experiment bred a strain of psychopaths. In the second experiment, the most productive cages were selected, all the hens within the most productive cages. And that resulted in a hyper-cooperative strain of hen. You see all of them are fully feathered. They even look pretty happy, in my opinion. And so this is exactly what you would expect from between group selection. And so this is the artificial selection equivalent of my Monopoly example. And here's yet another example from nature. This is work by a graduate student of mine named Omar Eldakar. And it's on a wonderful insect called the water strider. I think you probably have water striders in Brazil. They live in lakes and in streams, and they skate over the surface of the water, and they scavenge on insects that fall into the water. And the males vary greatly in their aggressiveness towards females. Some males could only be described as sexual predators. They hunt females and then attempt to forcibly mate with them. Other males are more docile. They're more like gentlemen who wait to be asked. And so Omar formed groups of water striders, 6 males and 6 females, and he varied the proportion of the docile and the aggressive males. Some of the pools had mostly aggressive, others mostly docile, some in between. And on the top graph, what this shows is that within any single group, just like the aggressive hens, the most aggressive males got the most matings. And so there's your evolutionary force weighing in favor of selfishness, of low pro behavior. But those groups were not very productive as groups because the females were terrorized basically. And so they didn't eat much and they couldn't lay many eggs. And so there was a threefold difference in the productivity of groups based on the proportion of docile males. And so now we have one evolutionary force within groups weighing in favor of selfishness, another force weighing in favor of cooperation. And in this case, what you get is a mix, Selection is going only one direction at the small scale within groups, only in one direction at the between group scale, but that results in, basically it keeps both types in the population. And so we see individual differences. And I stress that this mix is not good for the population. The population would be best if all the males were docile. But so group selection, in this case, has kept some docile males in the population, but it has not entirely eliminated the aggressive males. Now here's yet another example, such an important one. Cancer. What is cancer? So a cancer cell is the quintessential example of multi-level selection in action. Cancer cells proliferate at the expense of the cooperative cells within the body. And so it is adaptive at that scale. Cancer cells are more adaptive than the cooperative cells. Obviously, this is socially disruptive in the same way as aggressive male water striders. Evolution has no foresight, so the fact that cancer cells ultimately lead to their own demise is beside the point. Defenses against cancer evolved by between individual selection. Individuals who are well defended against cancer survive and reproduce better than those that are vulnerable to cancer. And just like the water strider example, our bodies have evolved to be very good at preventing cancer, but not perfect. And so cancer still exists and is maintained in the population. And so this multi-level view of cancer is, I think, maybe obvious in retrospect, but it's a breakthrough in providing a conceptual foundation for cancer research. And now, of course, this talk is about it providing a conceptual foundation for basically therapy and training. So isn't it wonderful? Isn't it amazing that this simple idea has so many applications? Here's one more, our microbiomes. And we didn't know about microbiomes. The term microbiome was only coined about 20 years ago. I think it was 2000 that the term was coined. And before, we thought that just individuals were collections of genes and all the genes were identical except for mutations. And so that was so very simple. But now we know that in addition to our genes, every multicellular organism is an entire planet, really, an entire ecosystem of small creatures in addition to our genes, more of their cells than ours by some estimation, trillions of cells. And so when we survive or not, survive and differentially survive and reproduce as individuals, this is not just the selection of our genes, but it's become individual microbiome communication. So even ecosystems can evolve to become organisms if selection takes place at the ecosystem level, level. And so one thing that this has led to is a concept called major evolutionary transitions. So now, if we have an intuition about multi-level selection, we can note that this balance between levels of selection that's been represented in the water strider example in cancer is not static, but can itself evolve. And when mechanisms evolve that suppress within group selection to a sufficient degree, then between group selection becomes the main evolutionary force. And when this happens, the group becomes so cooperative, so functionally integrated that it actually becomes a higher level organism in its own right. This was beyond the imagination of Darwin. The idea that individuals evolved not only by small mutational steps from other individuals, but individuals can also evolve as social groups becoming so cooperative that they become individuals was only conceived in the 1970s by a cell biologist named Lynn Margulis, who used it to explain the evolution of nucleated cells from bacterial cells. So the nucleated cells of our body are actually symbiotic communities of microbes. We are elaborated microbes. And now every biological entity that we currently recognize as an organism is in fact a highly regulated social group of lower level entities that evolved by group level selection. Isn't that amazing? The concept of society as an organism, as a society, is literally fused based on this concept of major evolutionary transition. Okay, so I now would like to declare success. We have come up with a paradigm that can replace individualism, and not only individualism, but also the kind of functionalism that existed prior to individualism, which tended to be axiomatic about groups as organisms, as society as an organism, as if there was no other way. And what's special about multi-level selection theory is that it is not axiomatic about the unit of functional organization. It's capable of assessing the presence or absence of functional organization on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes that unit of functional organization is below the level of the individual, such as a cancer cell. Sometimes it is the individual. Sometimes it's the group of individuals. Sometimes it's an ecosystem. And so it all depends on the level of selection. And so we truly have gone beyond individualism with this framework. And if that weren't exciting enough, it makes sense of the origin of our own species. Here we have a picture of a small-scale human society, and one of our closest relatives, the chimpanzee. We share 99% of the same genes, but there is a night and day difference in our social behavior. Naked aggression is over 100 times more common in a chimpanzee community than in a human community. And so why is this? What accounts for this amazing difference? Now, chimps do cooperate some, but there's a little competition and a lot of disruptive competition. And even the cooperation that exists in a chimp community is the Game of Thrones type, where alliances form that compete against other alliances. The primary context for a whole community of chimps cooperating is in competition with other chimp communities, just like the game of Monopoly, just like my example of the game of Monopoly. So why are we different? Several reasons, but the one to bring out is social control mechanisms. We have strong social control mechanisms in human groups which suppress bullying and other forms of disruptive behavior. If somebody tries to push their weight in a human community, in many human communities, everyone else just gangs up upon them, and that suppresses them. Christopher Boehm, the author of this book, Moral Origins, calls this reverse dominance. Reverse dominance. Instead of the strongest individual exercising their power, the whole group exercises their power against the stronger, against the bullies. And so here's what we can say about multi-level selection and human evolution. This essentially explains human moral systems. We can think of our moral systems as like an immune system that protects us against cancerous, selfish behavior. And just like the immune system, it hasn't entirely eliminated selfish behavior. It's always operating, often challenged, sometimes overcome. And us humans, just like we can play the single game of Monopoly or we can play the tournament version, we're also capable of acting in selfish mode or cooperative mode, depending upon the context. But for the most part, human moral systems are sufficiently strong that they suppress the potential for monopoly-like behavior within single groups. And so between group selection becomes the dominant evolutionary force. And that's why our species experienced a major transition. Cooperation is the signature adaptation of our species, thanks largely to social control. And it has resulted in myriad forms of cooperation, both physical and mental. And so nearly everything that is distinctively human can be seen as a form of cooperation. And I think you can see how different this is from the intellectual tradition of individualism, in which everything is explained as a form of individual selfishness. So physical forms of cooperation include hunting, gathering, childcare, modifying the physical environment, predator defense, and of course, offense and defense against other groups. Because just like the Monopoly tournament example, throughout history, human groups have cooperated internally to compete against other groups. Cognitive forms of cooperation include perception, memory, decision-making, just about everything that we think of as an individual property psychologically actually has always taken place in a group context, but especially the capacity for symbolic thought. Symbolic thought is inherently a cooperative activity. Maintaining an inventory of symbols with shared meaning and transmitting them across generations is inherently a cooperative activity. And when symbolic thought evolved, became sufficiently elaborated, it became an inheritance system in its own right, operating alongside the genetic inheritance system. And this is called dual inheritance theory. So everyone listening to this has a collection of genes. We call that your genotype. Those genes cause influence just about anything that could be measured about you. We call that your phenotype. Because you're human, every one of you has some collection of interrelated symbols inside your head. That goes by many names: worldview, meaning system, a religion, theory, whatever is inside your head. Let's call it your symbotype to stress the similarity to genotypes. And your symbotype influences just about anything that could be measured about you, the very same phenotype. And your symbotype and genotype interact with each other, upregulating and downregulating your genes, and have been co-evolving with each other throughout our history as a species. And I get just tremendous intellectual stimulation out of this comparison, thinking of our symbolic systems as like our genes. For me, that has tremendous metaphorical transfer that we're only beginning to fathom, basically what it means to think of our symbolic worlds as like our genes. Well, there's so many wonderful books on this topic, a whole canon of books that I encourage you to read. One of my most respected colleagues is Joseph Henrich at Harvard University. His two books, The Secret of Our Success and The Weirdest People in the World. I wonder how many people listening to this know the acronym WEIRD. It stands for Western, Educated, Industrial, Rich, and Democratic. And what Henrik and others are showing is that weird societies, weird cultures are really weird. I mean, they're different than so many other cultures, but we don't know that because 98% of scientists and scholars are done by weird people. And so we have been confusing our culture for human nature all these years. and Joe's work and others is just amazing to kind of get out of that box and to appreciate the full range of cultural diversity, and also what was it about our cultures that made us so peculiar and so prosperous So it's a wonderful story. Both of those books are wonderful reads. And then here's another suggestion, my colleague, Peter Turchin, who is pioneering the study of history, human history as cultural multi-level selection. In his book, Ultra Society, he covers the last 10,000 years. The subtitle is How 10,000 Years of War Made Humans the Greatest Cooperators on Earth. And so you can see once again that paradox that cooperation at one level is caused by competition at another level. And his book, Ages of Discord, is an analysis of American history, a detailed analysis of American history, which explains a lot about what's happening today. What he shows is that graph that you see there, American history has been a roller coaster of cooperation or discord. That first peak there is the 1830s, which was called by historians the era of good feelings. And it was when America was visited by the French social theorist Alexis de Tocqueville in the 1830s, where there was a lot of cooperation going on. But then competition took over, and that led to what was called the Gilded Age and the Great Depression, of course, the Civil War. And so a spike in discord. And then that led to the New Deal, a period of prosperity and relative sharing, although of course not entirely and not to many minorities, but nevertheless, an era of relative of cooperation. And now here we are back in the second Gilded Age and a degree of discord which rivals the American Civil War. And so this is so very important for understanding current events. This information, I'm about to turn to clinical psychology, but I think you can see the many, many other applications. And so just to consolidate this really perverse dynamic that what's virtuous at one scale permutes to vice at a larger scale. What's good for me can be bad for my family. What's good for my family can be bad for my clan. What's good for my clan can be bad for my nation. What's good for my nation can be bad for the planet. In general, adaptation at any level requires a process of selection at that level and tends to be undermined by selection at lower levels. That is the message of multi-level selection. And what it leads to is a whole earth ethic. The only way to solve this problem is to select our practices with the welfare of the whole earth in mind. All the lower level units don't go away. They remain important, but they must be coordinated with the global common good in mind. That's what science tells us. That's what multi-level selection tells us. And so it's a very, very benign conclusion, a wonderful conclusion to reach scientifically, especially for people who already have a whole earth ethic and now can have a foundation, an additional foundation for why it is true. Now, having emphasized that we must act for the global good, it is also true that the small group is a fundamental unit of social organization. It was the only scale of society for most of our genetic evolution. And so a panoply of innate psychological mechanisms have evolved to operate at this scale, most beneath conscious awareness. And so when we remove an individual from small cooperative groups, it's a little, actually more than a little, like removing an ant from its colony. If you find an ant that's lost its way, don't try to give the ant therapy, return the ant to its colony. And Tocqueville, who I mentioned, he knew this. He studied big social groups, comparing France with America in the 1800s, but he also said the village or township is the only association which is so perfectly natural that it seems to constitute itself. And Plum Village was a unit like that. So the small groups are like the cells of multicellular society. What is the social physiology of small groups? Why do they work so well when they are appropriately structured? They have the capacity to create, monitor, and enforce norms. Basically, your status within the group is based on your reputation, what you're doing for the group, rather than coercive domination. If someone misbehaves, there's a capacity to punish deviant behavior, typically at very small cost to the punishers. And in addition to these mechanisms which obligate members to stay in solid citizen mode, morality has two faces. There's a compulsory face, things that we agree to do and hold ourselves to that. And then there's also the voluntary face, where we want to help others based on the emotions of sympathy, empathy, and love that make people want to help each other. They don't need to be forced. And so once again, these are the basic elements of human morality. And now I get to introduce Jim Cohen and do a little time check here. I think I'm doing okay. Jim Cohen is a clinical neuroscientist at the University of Virginia, and he has a wonderful story to tell, which is that he had a client who was an old man, a war veteran, who was experiencing traumatic symptoms late in life. And the old man wouldn't do anything that Jim asked him to do. He was unresponsive to therapy. And eventually he said, I want my wife with me. And Jim had never received this request before. So his wife came, and at first Jim treated her like a bystander, and the old man was no more responsive than before. And then his wife said, let me hold his hand. And so she held his hand, and her husband suddenly became responsive to therapy, very responsive to therapy. And Jim was amazed. He wanted to know what happened in this gentleman's brain on the basis of holding hands. And so he embarked upon a set of experiments in which he would put people, like college students, in an fMRI machine, and he would stress them by threatening electric shock. And then he would do this under three conditions, which was alone, holding the hands of a stranger, and holding the hands of a loved one. And holding the hands of a loved one had this enormous calming effect on the brain, which Jim now has studied in many different experiments. And so this led Jim to formulate something called social baseline theory, which is very evolutionary. It notes that the one constant of the human ancestral environment was to live in highly cooperative groups. And so the human brain and body evolved in this context, seamlessly integrating personal and social resources when making its trade-off decision. And so the isolated individual is the highly stressed individual. The normal, natural condition is to be holding hands or the equivalent, to be surrounded by social support. And the pathological condition is the individual that is coping with all of this alone. And an experiment by one of Jim's colleagues, Dennis Profit, is a wonderful, wonderful illustration of this. So imagine that I take you to the base of a long hill like this, and I ask you to estimate its slope, which you do. And then I do this depleting your personal resources. So before and after fasting, before or after a workout, with or without a heavy backpack. And when you deplete somebody's personal resources, not only do they feel less like climbing the hill, but they actually perceive the hill as more steep. Their inclination to climb the hill influences their very perception of the slope of the hill. And so against that background, what do you think happens with an individual by themselves or an individual with a friend next to them? Not necessarily holding hands, but just an individual with a friend. So lo and behold, the hill becomes less steep. Let's climb that hill, you say, with a friend, when you didn't want to do it by yourself. And so this is such a wonderful illustration of how our brains, beneath our conscious awareness, are factoring in social resources and individual resources, seamlessly integrating them in making the trade-off decision as to whether we want to climb the hill. And so here's a passage from the article that I've written with Jim. This is in his words, but let me read it slowly here. A social baseline theory suggests that the group level model of self is the default, that our baseline estimate of resource availability assumes embeddedness in a social system, treating departures from the social system as inherently threatening and requiring an obligatory stress response. If true, clinical psychology's tendency to focus on individuals has placed clinical practice in the difficult and perhaps even nonsensical position of attempting to work with a more or less fictional psychological framework. We work primarily with individuals on putatively individual problems, but the individuals we work with don't even do that. We stress that abundant evidence supports this view. Humans think, perceive, emote, develop, suffer, and yes, recover differently in the presence of familiar and trusted others than they do any of these things alone. The implications for how clinicians do their work and what effects they can expect their work to have are thus manifest and only beginning to be known. And here's a meta-analysis that makes the same point. It is an analysis of treatments for adult depression. And what it shows is that 33% of client improvement is due to factors outside of therapy. 50% is due to just establishing a basic nurturing relationship with the client. That's called non-directive support. And only 17% is due to the specific type of treatment, such as a particular kind of psychotherapy or pharmacotherapy. And even this 17% is likely to be an overestimate. And so this is such an illustration of how basically social support is essential for mental health. A little bit about the distinction between therapy and training. If we have a bell-shaped curve of how well you're functioning, then if you're at the low end, then we say that you need therapy. If you're in the middle range or at the high end, you benefit from training. And even at the very highest end, even the most elite athletes and chess players or benefit from training. And the important point is that the same principles operate across the entire range. What's needed for therapy is a little different than what's needed for training. And so the implications for this, which follow very directly from what I have said, is that the unit of therapy training should be the unit of functional organization. We need to be studying the watch, not the cog, or we need to be studying the beehive, not the individual bee. And so if you could only work with individuals, then you should help them improve their social environments in addition to working on interchange. And we should also find opportunities to actually work at the level of the functionally organized units rather than just being confined to work with individuals. And sports teams provide a wonderful example that is familiar to all of us. In sports teams, of course, there is physical and psychological training at the individual level. There is also extensive training at the team level and the integration between the two levels of training. Training is continuous, it never ends. All of this goes without saying for team sports. And so we need to generalize this familiar example to other contexts where the need for multi-level training is not so obvious. So how can we get engaged? I'll briefly discuss the ACBS, the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science, which many of you are familiar about. Pro-Social World, which is my organization, excuse me, and an ongoing project in Latin America funded by a grant from the Templeton World Charity Foundation. So ACBS has over 10,000 practitioners worldwide, a Brazilian chapter. I believe that MAIO was the president of it, past president of it, and has become a major vehicle for both the learning and action components of pro-social world. And so I encourage everyone to join the ACBS and then join its special interest group, evolutionary science special interest group. There's a picture of Steve and Paul Atkins, who is the co-founder of Pro-Social World. Our organization has the mission of consciously evolving a world that works for all. Our main differentiator is we take that word evolution very seriously. We are possibly the only organization that has taken this paradigm that I have described to you and have attempted to put it into action. Thanks largely to Paul. We have trained over 700 facilitators in 34 countries, working with communities at all levels to study and steward their cultural evolution. And there's two pillars to what we do. We like to say that evolutionary theory is the foundation. And the two pillars are contextual behavioral science, that's basically where ACT comes from, and work by Elinor Ostrom, which is called the Core Design Principles. And these two pillars enable us to work with groups of any kind and any scale to help to steward their cultural evolution. So Elinor Ostrom, I wonder how many of you already know about her. Whenever I ask audiences, typically there's only a smattering of hands. She was a political scientist by training. She won the Nobel Prize in economics in 2009, although she was not an economist. And what she did was study the tragedy of the commons. That's the tendency of people drawing upon natural resources to overexploit them. And she showed that these groups are capable of avoiding the tragedy of the commons. In other words, capable of managing their own affairs, but only if they possess certain core design principles. And here are the principles. As I go through them very quickly, please bring a group to mind, some group that you know well, and ask yourself the question, how well does this group implement the core design principles, and how well does it function as a group? So the groups that can self-manage have a strong sense of identity and purpose. They know they're a group, they know what they're doing, they think it's important, they know who is a member. There's a fair distribution of costs and benefits. It's not sustainable for some members to do all the work and for others to get the gain. Decision-making was fair and inclusive, not sustainable for some members to make the decisions and others to be left out. In the first place, that's a recipe for unfairness. In the second place, it does not make use of the wisdom of everyone in the group. Behaviors were monitored, and so we knew it was possible to know if people were behaving as they agreed upon. If they weren't, there were graduated sanctions for misbehaviors, which started out friendly and then escalated only when necessary. And also, it's important to abundantly praise good behaviors in addition to discouraging bad behaviors. Conflicts always will occur, and they must be resolved in a way that's fast and fair. The group must have the authority to govern its own affairs. Otherwise, they can't do those other things. And there must be appropriate relations with other groups which reflect the same core design principles. And this is so important because it means that the core principles are scale independent. They are needed to govern relations among groups just as much as relations within groups. And so just take a little bit to reflect upon these for a group that you brought to mind. And I hope you can see, just on the basis of the short time that I have with you, how well these groups map on to multi-level selection theory, with the first core design principle defining the group, principles 2 through 6 regulating the group, and then principles 7 to 8 regulating between groups. In a group that implements the core design principles, it's very difficult to play the single game of Monopoly. And so therefore, the group naturally operates in team mode. So I was privileged to work with Lynn for 3 years before her death in 2012. What we did was generalize the core design principles to show that they basically apply to any kind of group. And so the bold prediction is that no matter what kind of group, if we study them, we will show that they vary in how well they perform. And that variation will be explained largely by how well the group implements the core design principles. And here is a study that documents that bold claim. And in this study, we did basically what I asked you to do. We asked the participants to bring 2 groups to mind. Let one be a work group, a place of employment, and let the other be any other group of your choice. And then they provided information on how well the groups implemented the core design principles and how well they function as groups on the basis of trust, satisfaction, needs, cooperation, and commitment. And the results were that a strong correlation between implementation of the CDPs and performance as a group. That included business groups. Business groups were no different, but on average, business groups were deficient in all 8 core design principles. There is the deficiencies, and the biggest deficits were in CDP 7, that's local autonomy. So many people in their jobs cannot do their work as they see fit. CDP 1, So many people in their jobs don't find meaning in their work. And CDP3, so many people in their jobs are not part of the decisions that influence them. And I'm sure that that sounds familiar to many of you. So why is it that business groups are deficient in all 8 core design principles? I stress this is only the average. Business groups vary just like any other kind of group. And some business groups do very well indeed, thanks to the fact that they implement the core design principles. A big reason is what's inside our head when we think about business and the economy. So if you're like Milton Friedman here, and you have a shareholder value model, then that will cause you to see the world. That will be your symbotype, will cause you to see the world in a different way than if the core design principles are in your head. And so I think this speaks very nicely to this concept of dual inheritance and how much our phenotypes, how we act, depend upon our symbotypes, how we think about the world. And that's why if there was a paradigm change and we could go beyond individualism and to the multi-level view right away, thanks to that change in the symbotype, the change in perspective, we would start doing things in a more sustainable way than we were before, just about the difference in the way we were thinking about it. So here's just a little bit about how ACT, which was developed by Steve Hayes and many others, is beginning to be seen by even by Steve himself as a form of personal evolution. So we can think of ourselves as, to a large extent, an open-ended evolutionary process. We're selected by consequences, as B.F. Skinner put it in a famous science paper in 1981. And what this means is that left unmanaged, our personal evolution often takes us where we don't want to go. I've already shown that biological evolution doesn't make everything nice. And the same is true of personal evolution. It adapts us in a very limited sense. And that's not the same as adapting us in the sense of going towards our valued goals. And so that being the case, therapy and training can be seen as a form of aligning our personal evolution with our normative goals. And ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy and training, is one of the most validated methods out there. This graph is an old graph. It's at 300 randomized controlled trials. Actually, now it's over 1,000. That's how much research is being done on a whole galaxy of behaviors. And I'm going to just mention a few studies in more detail, just to show you in a little more detail about psychological flexibility or adaptability. This is a study of natural variation in psychological flexibility. And so people vary in their flexibility without any training. Everyone experiences stress. But the question is, when does stress undermine mental health? And the answer is, it's based a lot on how flexible you are. The more flexible you are, the more that moderates the effect of stress on mental health. It's when you're not flexible that the mental health impacts arise. And so is flexibility trainable? Yes, it is. And that's pretty much what ACT does. Here's another study, which is a micro intervention. Couple received 15 minutes of ACT training, and their behavior was monitored over a 1-week period using the experience sampling method. That's when you're beeped at random times during the day. And so that measured their behavior on a moment-by-moment basis. And they also played an economics game 1 week later, in which one member of the pair was given an amount of money and then was asked to share as much as they wanted with another member of the pair. And in both cases, the people that received this micro intervention were more generous to each other. I'm trying to do a time check. I think I'm within good time. And so I really do want to drill down to a level of detail here. So here's the description in that paper of the micro intervention. What was this that had such a powerful effect? And so the micro intervention took on average 15 minutes. In a first step, participants were instructed to describe struggles and stress they're currently experiencing within their daily life. In a second, they were asked about people, activities, and other things in their lives that are genuinely important to them. Here we're picking our valued goals as our target of selection in evolutionary terms. Using an experiential metaphorical exercise, participants were asked to experience how their struggles interfered with the things that they valued. Then, skills of present moment awareness and acceptance were practiced with the goal of experiencing more flexibility to make room for the things with which they struggle. Thereafter, the relationship to their values was once again probed. The overarching goal of the short exercise was to experience that pushing away, avoiding, and struggling with stress makes it more difficult to interact with meaningful individuals and to do meaningful activities. So here, I think you can see this as a way of aligning evolutionary forces with valued goals, which are made the target of selection. The introduced skills aim to help participants be aware of this, choose whether to use acceptance, and to consciously focus on meaningful people and activities. This flexibility training was written down, including practice instruction. So practice was important. And having just come from Plum Village, I know that the kind of mindfulness which is practiced in a spiritual tradition, such as Zen Buddhism, is very, very similar to the kind of mindfulness which has been developed by ACT. Here's one more study. This is called bibliotherapy. The treatment was to read a book and to do the exercises. The participants were teachers responding to a wellness program. Basically, they were experiencing burnout. 75% were above clinical cutoffs for general mental health, depression, anxiety, or stress. And it was a randomized waitlist treatment. And so we have the first ones, read the book, they get better. Second one, period of time goes by, then they read the book and they get better. But what I love about this graph is the difference between post and follow-up, because what could have happened, they could have relapsed, they could have stayed the same, but instead they got better during this period after the experiment was over. And what can that mean? But that they had internalized something by reading the book, their symbotypes had been changed, and then they had continued to practice and gotten still better on their own. Isn't that amazing? Reading the book had about a third of the benefit of actually seeing a ACT therapist. Well, we have this project in Latin America, working with 11 organizations throughout Latin America, including Brazil, to improve their own governance and adaptability, to introduce pro-social to other groups in their ecosystem. So now we can see how we're choosing our units of training to be the actual units of functional organization and endogenizing the training model to take it to scale. So basically the people being trained, the facilitators are from the same culture, and those who are being trained can become the trainers. Two of our primary partners are Marcelo de Castillo and Michelle Taminato, and their organization is Collab Soul. And so right there in Brazil. I'm done. And so just to summarize, we've been through so much. What I've tried to present to you is, in the first place, a critique of individualism. And then I have proposed a new paradigm, multi-level selection, as an alternative. Multi-level selection identifies the presence and absence of functional organization at multiple scales, and it reveals that therapy and training must take place at multiple scales. And then I've tried to provide opportunities to get involved through ACBS, Pro-Social World, and our current project in Latin America. And I have left 10 minutes for comments.
Uau, incrível, incrível. Uma pequena questão que eu fiquei com relação à ACBS Brasil, realmente quem não conhece a ACBS, a associação, vale a pena se aproximar e conhecer, que é um grupo incrível. Eu fui presidente de 2019 a 2021, atualmente a presidente é a Roberta Kovac. Eles têm um funcionamento de grupo também. São 3 presidentes, o eleito, o atual e o passado, então sempre se ajudando também, uma associação incrível. Bem, vamos ver então, temos um tempinho para perguntas, para comentários, tantas informações incríveis aqui que
Yes, I have a question. Is there maybe a group advantage about keeping aggressive males? Group conflicts would benefit with more aggressive males. Absolutely, absolutely. And that we have to realize that the idea of worldwide cooperation is so new that it was beyond the imagination until 1 or 2 centuries ago. Before then, it was always groups against, some us, and very often some them. And so, of course, we need aggressive males for warfare and so on. But this, I think, reveals the importance of context. And it's possible for males to be aggressive in warfare, but that doesn't mean that they must be aggressive as far as within group interactions are concerned. Those things can be decoupled. And there's many, many examples of that. So aggressiveness, as with everything else, is highly context dependent. And it's amazing. It has always been the case that humans have participated in multiple groupings simultaneously. It's true in our own lives. We exist in all these groups. That's always been the case. Hunting groups, gathering groups, warfare groups. And we're so good at this that we could actually recognize the context of any particular grouping and then follow the norms of that context. And so that would be aggressive in warfare, docile as far as within group interactions. People are capable of that.
And sorry, I was thinking about symbol type diversity as maybe some protective factor, like genetic diversity, as we see in a society for defense against diseases and such things. Could there be a relation about both?
That's a great question about symbotype diversity as being like genetic diversity. And the point I would make there is that diversity is by itself is neither, well, there's good and bad forms of diversity. So to pick the water strider example, there were individual differences in male aggressiveness, but that didn't make the population better. The population would have been better. But in most real world situation, you do want to mix. And so there is such a thing as adaptive diversity. And it's a very interesting thing to think about. Of course, division of labor is huge, and that's not just economic. I think that and this, by the way, is also true in animal populations. Something I studied in my biological days were personality differences between non-human, like fish and birds. some are shy and some are bold, and so yeah, a group has a diversity, and often that diversity is very adaptive. I don't know much about hormonal effects, by the way, so I don't want to. I'm no authority on the actual effects of testosterone, so I'm going to duck that question. So you need to find another expert about testosterone.
David, e como é o trabalho do Pro-Social World?
Well, for any organization, no matter how small or large, we have a process where first we pretty much work on the first core design principle, and in ACT terms, basically building up the valued goals. And so in your organization or your group, why is it important? What values does it represent? And then after the group, the meaning of the group has become elevated in your mind, then you ask the question, okay, what would you do on the basis of those values? What should the group be doing? And there we have, you're building up the symbotype, that's what's inside your head. And then you're building up the phenotype, what we're actually going to do. And then you visit all the things that take you away from that. I'm describing the ACT matrix, basically. And then you acknowledge their existence, you accept their existence, and you commit to working around them in order to achieve your valued goals. And that's what ACT is. And it works even better at the group level than at the individual level, because the group is so much better at keeping each other on the right side of the matrix. Then there's a review of the core design principles. And a kind of a self-examination. And then there's some work as to how do we do better implementing these principles. Then there's some goal setting. And apologies for coughing. And then the group has become well structured. And then they can get things done. Then there's the multi-group. That's the within group. But now your group is interacting with other groups. And so we build up the multi-group dimension. And so I think that it's very simple. Typically, it's very enjoyable. And so I encourage everyone out there to check it out. And we're really trying to expand the Latin America project, expand our network. And you can basically join that process at an exploratory way, and that will help us expand faster.
O David falou na Matrix, é uma ferramenta da terapia de aceitação e compromisso que ajuda a ter perspectiva e observar o que é importante na vida, quais as ações que podem levar em direção ao que é importante, e quais são os obstáculos também que impedem, e muitas vezes a gente fica preso numa armadilha. Então, é uma ferramenta bem boa para a gente poder se observar. E sim, pode ser utilizada com grupos também. E te ouvindo, David, aqui nessa instituição a gente chama a família CEFI, porque sim, a gente não consegue enxergar um indivíduo, a gente vê grupos, a gente vê famílias, a gente vê casais, e por isso que a gente chama, inclusive, a instituição como família, porque sim, é o contexto, né? Não tem como dissociar do contexto. Agradeço muito, muito, muito a contribuição, quantas ideias, quantas coisas que a gente tem para estudar um pouco mais, depois que o David trouxe também. Enfim, aqui foi recém-lançada uma abertura para a gente seguir nessa linha de comunidade, nessa linha de ajuda, nessa linha de troca e crescimento. David, muito obrigada de novo pela disponibilidade em estar aqui com a gente.
Thank you. And now I have to rush to catch a plane.
Sim, ele estava no retiro, está na Europa e agora vai voltar para o seu... Esteve aqui no Brasil e agora vai voltar para o seu país. Muito obrigada. Ok, lembrando...
So thank you very much, everyone.
Muito obrigada,
Thank
David.
you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Tchau, tchau, abração. Lembrando, pessoal, quem tirar alguma foto do evento e compartilhar nas mídias, colocar @CEFIPOA ou hashtag Congresso CEFI, vai concorrer a cursos, workshops, eventos do CEFI e livros da parceria com a Sinopsis. E a Sinopsis também organizou um cupom de desconto de 15%. A Sinopsis está lançando livros maravilhosos. Congresso CEFI, vocês vão receber o cardzinho ali, e aí tem direito aos descontos também. Ok? Vamos para um pequeno intervalo e seguem as atividades do evento. Até breve!